Good evening, everyone. I'm going to reward the prompt here. I know we're all very excited about tonight, so I'm eager to get us started. So thank you so much for joining us, both in person and by Zoom. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and my pronouns are she and her. And you may know that as I begin, I always like to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotch tank, also acknowledged as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. And these are the native people on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 12th annual Frederick J. Fisher Lecture. I know we are all excited to hear about tonight's speaker, about the exhibition Making Her Mark, History of Women Artists in Europe, 1400 to 1800, which featured several pieces of Madame Benippe's porcelain from Hillwood's collection, which are, thankfully, safely back where they belong, here at Hillwood. Now, this lecture is named in honor of Hillwood's former executive director, who served for 20 years from 1990 to 2010. Fred and his wife Becky are joining us from their home tonight, and I just want to take a moment to say hello and welcome to this talk in your honor, Fred. We are so pleased to have audiences joining us for tonight's program, both here in the theater and also by Zoom. For those of you in the theater, you know what comes next, right? Make sure you silence all of your devices so we don't hear that odd chirp in the middle. And for those of you at home, you may submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom whenever they cross your mind, and we'll get to as many as we can from both locations at the end. If you've not yet seen our current special exhibition, Fragile Beauty, Art of the Ocean, I invite you to come back soon. It's only here for a few more weeks. It'll be on view until January 5th. Of course, Hillwood's magnificent holiday decorations are already up. I'm sure you've seen them twinkling all around the estate. We are calling this installation "'Tis the Season." We're so clever, aren't we? Of course, it was inspired by Fragile Beauty. There are 5 themed trees, 4 in the mansion and 1 right out here, as well as many festive touches that are really everywhere. So you can learn more about these and all other things Hillwood on our website, hillwoodmuseum.org. And I know there may be 1 or 2 of you who are not yet members. What can I say? I do invite you to join today and make the most of your benefits this season, which of course include what? Generous discount in the museum shop. I know I see lots of bags. I know you understand that. Okay. Now, before I hand the mic over, I want to share a bit about tonight's speaker. Dr. Andaleeb Banta is the Senior Curator and Department Head of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She is a specialist in Renaissance and Baroque art of Europe with a focus on Old Master works on paper. In her current position, she curates a wide variety of exhibitions that highlight works of art from the 15th century to the present day. Earlier, she was curator of European and American art at the Allen Memorial Art Gallery at Oberlin College and assistant curator of prints and drawings at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. She has published and presented on numerous European artists of the early modern period. Most recently, she co-curated the International Loan Exhibition, Making Her Mark, A History of Women Artists of Europe, 1400 to 1800, which was co-organized with the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. And of course, we will hear a whole lot more about that this evening. At the end of the talk, she will also be signing that gorgeous book which if you don't have it already, of course is available upstairs in the museum shop. And I have very fresh news to share, if you don't already know this. She has just been appointed the Andrew W. Mellon Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Art, where she starts her new position on January 12th. So she will be even closer to us and have a much shorter commute. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Andaleeb Banta to the podium.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Okay, great. Can I see? That's the other question here. All right. So, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank the staff here at Hillwood for the invitation to give this annual Frederick J. Fisher Lecture. I am honored to speak here about women artists in the context of a gorgeous collection and estate that was founded by a formidable woman collector, Marjorie Merriweather Post. It feels very apt. So, as you heard, in October 2023, the exhibition Making Her Mark, A History of Women Artists in Europe, 1400 to 1800, opened at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Co-organized with the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, this exhibition was intended as an ambitious corrective to widely held, if not always openly acknowledged, assumptions that women artists of this period were rare, or that what they made was not of the same significance as those by their male counterparts. The result of nearly 5 years of research and consultation with an international team of scholars and curators, the exhibition brought together over 230 works produced by women makers during the pre-modern era. In doing so, we endeavored to prompt questions about which art and which artists are featured in museums and why others historically have not received this prominence. In its purposefully broad chronological, geographical, and material scope, Making Her Mark sought to make visible historical women who produced across media within lauded so-called high art categories, as well as those typically characterized as material culture, and to examine how materiality and gender were linked both in the past and still are today in museum practice. For the purposes of this talk, I thought I would share with you a bit about how this exhibition came to be, the stories of some of the works that are included, and what it took to make this presentation a reality. My comments are primarily framed within the context of museums' traditions and priorities, but let me acknowledge from the start that none of this work could have been done without the decades of academic and archival scholarship on women artists that has occurred in the fields of art history, gender studies, and material culture. And these efforts continue today with the release of new publications devoted to women artists seemingly every month. There we go. With a robust body of feminist scholarly work spanning the last 50 years, one might wonder why such an exhibition is still needed, particularly at a moment that has recently seen several major exhibitions in North America and Europe focused on women artists, and I'm just selected a few from the last 3 years to show you. Although historical women artists have garnered a fair amount of attention in museums lately, organizing this exhibition made clear how our collective cultural perspective of the past continues to be shaped by biases towards the narrative of exceptional male genius. Even though women comprise half of the world's population, works by women artists make up significantly less than 50% of most museum collections. You can see the stats there on the right. Works by women before 1800 are even more sparse in museum galleries, and exhibitions devoted to early modern women remain but a small percentage of the already small percent focused on women from all eras. Further, the majority of the exhibitions about women artists promote the stories of so-called exceptional women artists, the most of whom were painters, presented in a biography-focused format. While these are valuable exercises in their own right, they continue to operate within a framework that has essentially sexist origins, casting women artists as rare and anomalous, a dynamic that has informed the way that women artists have been considered for centuries. In a 1649 letter to the Sicilian nobleman Antonio Ruffo, the celebrated Italian Baroque painter Artemisia Gentileschi referred to a work she had recently completed at his request, stating, quote, "I will show your illustrious lordship what a woman can do." This anecdote appeals to our modern sensibility of a woman advocating for and acknowledging the implications of her gender in a male-dominated art world. Like many women artists of the past, Artemisia Gentileschi was keenly aware of her status as a painter in a society that considered women artists to be curious, even unnatural, and she shrewdly used it to promote her work to high-powered patrons. As such, we were fortunate to have one of her most accomplished works in this exhibition, which you can see there on the screen, representing her storied ability to render the Jewish heroine Judith in stunningly dramatic contrasts of light and dark. Artemisia Gentileschi was not the first or the last woman artist of the pre-modern era to use her exceptional status as a painter to advance her artistic career, positioning herself under the protection of high-profile patrons. Indeed, 2 generations before her, Sofonisba Anguissola won favor as court painter to the Spanish Habsburgs in Madrid. In 18th century Paris, the portraitist Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun relied upon her close relationship with Queen Marie Antoinette to ensure her inclusion as one of the 4 women allowed in the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in 1783. In London, the still life painter Mary Moser and Swiss-born history painter Angelika Kaufmann were founding members of the Royal Academy of Arts in 1769, even though they were prohibited from attending the live nude model drawing classes alongside their male peers. Not fair. But these women's achievements, and the fact that we know of them, reflect the pervasive gendered narrative of exceptionalism that has shaped our understanding of Western art, largely to the detriment of creative women for centuries. The term exceptionality evokes notions of genius, celebrity, innovation, and quality, all gatekeeping concepts that were constructed for and by a privileged class of men as ideological cornerstones of the Western artistic canon that promoted large-scale painting and sculpture as the paragons of artistic accomplishment. That women's names do not appear in equal measure in the artistic biographies of both the past and the present is an indicator of the pervasive bias that continues to shape our understanding of the history of Western art, both in terms of an artist's gender and the type of work created, which tend to be linked. Even the term artist implies that certain extrinsic standards, historically defined by men, determine whether a woman who creates, fabricates, or labors towards an aesthetic product can be considered worthy of this professional classification. These exceptional women found a way to play by the rules that were established by men for men, but their stories were not the only ones worth telling. Their stories, in fact, are not reflective of the majority of women involved in the production of visual art during this period. In our research for this exhibition, we encountered objects and images that told a different story. Despite their historic lack of access to the same kinds of training and promotion that male artists enjoyed, women nevertheless worked in nearly every category of creative culture. They were far more involved in the artistic process of pre-modern Europe than has been traditionally acknowledged, and many of their largely anonymous or less documented lives were decidedly unexceptional by contemporary critical standards. We expanded our inquiries to include more personal and circumstance-specific examples of making that reveal frequently overlooked aspects of female creativity and labor across media, including women's involvement in the management and entrepreneurial aspects of art making, as well as women's roles, wholly unacknowledged, in procuring material goods used in artistic production. Many of the objects in this exhibition had no individual maker names associated with them, and many of them were likely the result of forced or unpaid labor at some or all of the stages of their production. While we remain in the dark about these undocumented makers, the inclusion of their finished products in the exhibition is a way to reclaim their essential contributions to exceptional objects. By presenting these objects together in the exhibition, we hope to change the way we think today about women makers of the past. As you can tell from the exhibition's title, we proposed an alternate history of European art, one which centered women as creative makers, where they are considered by default rather than as an exception or as anomalous. Where we could, we attempted to undermine the emphasis on lionized notions of individual and presumed male genius with a paintbrush or chisel that underpin foundational methods of research and publication in the art historical field. To convey the rich variety of contexts and media represented by named and unnamed women alike, we organized the exhibition into 4 umbrella thematic installations that allowed us to examine women's engagement with different chapters of European society and history through a multimedia layered approach. This organizational structure also disrupted the traditional practice of categorizing individual artists into regional or stylistic schools, or adhering to a linear chronology. By presenting tapestries alongside ceramics, lace with large-scale paintings, and embroidered objects next to silverwork, we drew attention to the historical reality that every work of art, without or with an identified name assigned to it, is the result of collaborative labor that involved women. Rather than fixate on works by exceptional artists, we chose instead to spotlight exceptional objects that collectively revealed broader narratives about the women who made them. Each theme had subsections within them that further illustrated not only the span of women's contributions, but also allowed for deeper investigation into areas that have received far less attention in scholarship, and invited visitors to consider women's engagement within various historical contexts. I'll quickly take us through some of the different subsections, but in the interest of time, I'll just provide an overview with highlighted examples. Here's my plug. The catalog covers everything. So, the first section presented works by women that addressed themes of faith and power. The works illustrated that women of all socioeconomic levels worked for the highest echelons of European art society, royal courts, noble households, and papal patronage, and the Catholic Church. While Lavinia Fontana, whose painting is there in the lower right, was establishing herself in the late 16th century as a portraitist to the moneyed classes of Bologna, other women and girls were pressed into labor making lace, typically manufactured in convents or orphanages across Europe by undocumented women at the lowest social stratum. Concurrently, some women achieved managerial roles in major artistic manufactories, such as Maria Maddalena della Riviera, who directed the papal-sponsored Barberini tapestry manufactory in Rome during the mid-17th century, and you can see an example of the tapestry in the left image there. Or they operated as independent business owners, such as the 18th century British silversmith Hester Bateman, who collaborated with the Jewish communities in Portsmouth and London to produce silver ritual objects. Women artists, such as the Portuguese painter Josefa Ayala de Obidos, who produced devotional imagery for the domestic setting, often specialized in subject matter such as the Virgin Mary, and there's an image of the Visitation on the right, meant specifically for Catholic female audiences. The convent was also a site of making, in which cloistered women produced works for their own use, such as that enormous antiphonal manuscript on the left, were used for collective prayer. And when I say enormous, each tome, we had 2 of them, weighed about 50 pounds. Or as objects that nuns could sell to pilgrims and the devout as a means to support their convent. This gilded frame reliquary that you see in the upper center image makes clear that nuns often used modest materials, in this case, rolled paper cut from the gilded foredges of books. So everything inside that frame is paper to create these spectacular devotional objects. The second section examined the concept of interiority, both as a state of mind as well as a place. Included are objects that women made for themselves, each other, their families, and friends. Several objects demonstrate that many women of means had rich intellectual lives, sustained through the study of music, literature, languages, and other fields. Some women were even able to pursue formal studies at universities, although very few of them were awarded official degrees for their work, such as the numismatist Gabriella Carola Patina. Her image is there in the middle, and it's a print made by another woman artist. Patina actually enrolled in the University of Padua, did all the coursework for the doctorate, and then at the end they said, oh, we're not going to give you the degree. I would have burned the place down. She did not, so we'll give her some credit. But we have a suspicion that this print was probably commissioned in place of that degree that she was never able to receive. Utilitarian objects produced within the domestic setting often reflected personal relationships, such as this fantastic 18th century cabinet on the right, decorated by the Bonnell sisters-in-law, with thousands of hand-rolled and dyed pieces of paper to replicate marquetry patterns. That's all paper. Yeah, it's a wow. Oh, and the other thing is the medallions in the middle that show landscapes, they're actually embroidered with hair, not thread. Use what you got, ladies. So, extraordinary and often touching examples of embroidery convey the labor women did to clothe their families and decorate their homes. Embroidery in particular was a fascinating way to track the generally overlooked connection of women and girls through the circulation of pattern books across the European continent and beyond, something that we came to call the needlework network. Luxury objects that women of means purchased for their homes from professional women makers also provided insight into women's involvement in the commercial aspect of artistic production. The role of the widow, especially in the areas of silver, ceramics, and furniture production, is a topic ripe for further investigation. And it's actually an area where it's kind of hiding in plain sight because particularly with furniture makers and silver production, these objects are stamped with individually registered silver maker stamps, marks. So we know that these women were involved. They just their names don't come forward in the record, or they're not placed on labels in museums. So it's quite literally right there, but no one's talking about it. The third section took us into the natural world and women's engagement with the early history of science. Here we took on two enduring bromides of art history. One, that still life painting was uniquely suited to women due to its less demanding intellectual requirements and those ladies' small hands. I have big hands, so I don't think that flies at all. And that women rarely engaged with the depiction of the human body and therefore could not become important artists. We demonstrated that women, like the Dutch still life painter Maria van Oosterwijk, her painting is there on the left, were deeply involved in the scientific communities that informed their aesthetic interpretations of botanical imagery. Floral varietals and hybrids developed in greenhouses across Europe were replicated by 45 women and girls employed in the Sèvres porcelain factory in a workshop headed by Marie-Henriette Gravin, and you can see examples of those ceramic flowers there, porcelain flowers. We received them from the lender loose, like you see them in the image, and so we constructed this wonderful faux view onto a garden and then populated it with the ceramic flowers because we really wanted to evoke the reason that those flowers were created was to create this false sense of nature inside, right? And we know, for example, that certain patrons would have those flowers arranged in, a seeming like a bouquet, and they would have perfumed papers tied to each of the stems that correlated to the flower that was being portrayed. So you had this olfactory experience as well. We couldn't do that. We wanted to do that, and I will talk about smell in a minute, but not in this case. So 45 women and girls handmade all of those porcelain flowers. We were also fortunate to be able to include drawings that illustrated numerous examples of women artists such as Mary Moser and Julia Lama, who pursued the study of the human body through the access to live models. This whole story that women didn't have access to the human body is just complete balderdash. Obviously, they had access to their own bodies, the bodies of their friends and family, and in the case of Julia Lama, she seems to have been able to have contracted male models to draw. Probably in private, would not have been allowed in the academy setting at all. Women's roles in the history of Western science, particularly in the fields of zoology, entomology, anatomy, and astronomy, among others, have long been understudied. Klaya Armart grew up viewing the night skies alongside her astronomer father in their family observatory in Nuremberg and created a series of 350 drawings of the phases of the moon as seen through the telescope. There's one of them on the left. These are absolutely stunning, and they're quite large. They're probably about 2.5 feet tall. Maria Sibylla Merian had a special relationship with caterpillars, which she raised in her home over several years in order to study their cycle of metamorphosis. Her deep interest in insects took her and her daughter Dorothea Maria as far as Suriname, then a Dutch colony, to engage with the native flora and fauna and record their observations and illustrations into a publication that has long been recognized as foundational in the field of entomology. Though Sarah Stone never left England, her employment to document Ashton Lever's Museum of Ethnographic and Natural Specimens put her in contact with taxidermy birds from around the world and established her career as a natural illustrator. And you can see the fantastic watercolor, again, quite large, on the right that my colleague Alexa Grice, the co-curator of the exhibition, was able to acquire for the Art Gallery of Ontario while we were planning the show. So that was like a total win, yes. Impressive as these accomplishments are, it also underscores the relationship of female scientific illustrators to the colonial practices of enslavement and extraction that facilitated their access to these specimens. In general, women artists of this period continue to be overlooked as active participants in international and global exchange. Now I want to take a moment here to highlight the fabulous, fabulous ceramics that Hillwood so kindly lent to the exhibitions, 6 plates from the South American Bird Service, and a magnificent vase with African and Indian birds by the bird painter Pauline Riffer de Courcelles, known as Madame Kniep. One of the few independent female contract workers at the Sèvres porcelain factory, Madame Kniep enjoyed royal patronage by Empress Marie-Louise, which gave her access to the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, where she could study specimens of exotic birds in that collection. Her careful study of South American bird feathers and color patterns informed the 84-piece service she created for the Duchesse of Angoulême, and who was the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In addition to her close observation of the birds, Kniep also positioned each bird on a branch that represents the bird's natural habitat or food source. The plate rims are stylized presentations of that plant's foliage, referencing the bird's indigenous locations. The stunning vase with African and Indian birds integrates lively renderings of the birds interacting with their young and standing majestically within a classically inspired decorative framework typical of the Restoration period. And this is on view in the mansion, and I highly recommend you go take a close look, particularly at those details under the so-called arms of the vase. It really is quite charming with the birds in the nest. This was a standout piece. Many people loved it, and the exhibition spent a lot of time looking at it. The last section of the exhibition celebrated the entrepreneurial spirit of the many women who established themselves in the business of making art within their communities as well as on an international scale. The Grand Tour offered a stage on which the pastelist Rosalba Carriera could launch an international career, known for her arrestingly fresh pastel portraits and allegorical figures made for visitors stopping in Venice as part of their itineraries. And we have an example of the pastel there, second from left, and I'll just give you a little side note. This was lent to us from the National Gallery of Art, which was very kind of them to do so, but I literally had to beg for it. Pastels are incredibly fragile. They are not only very light sensitive, but pre-19th century pastels tend not to be fixed. So it is literally just dust sitting on a piece of paper. But they were very kind, and they said, okay, well, it's just going to go to Baltimore. It's not going to Canada. So Toronto had one of their own, so that was good. It worked for us. The textile designs of Anna Maria Garthwaite also enjoyed global attention. You can see we had a full dress from Colonial Williamsburg on loan. It is a fantastic example of her botanically inspired patterns that were woven into clothing textiles in the manufactories of London's Spitalfield neighborhood. But then they traveled with settlers to the North American colonies, where they were regarded as high fashion and passed down within families for generations. So that's how this one ended up here in the United States. It went with a family that moved to what became Rhode Island and then down through the generations. Technical prowess secured the reputations of Maria Katharina Prestel and Mary Linwood. Prestel, whose print is on the left, developed an innovative multi-plate technique that earned her recognition in the field of reproductive printmaking in Germany and London. And that image on the left is a replication of a 16th century Italian drawing by Jacopo Ligozzi. But what makes it particularly remarkable is not only its faithfulness to the drawing, but then she figured out a way to use gold dust as the highlight. So all that yellow that you see, that's shimmering gold. It's really quite stunning in person. While Linwood displayed her genre-defying needle paintings that she displayed in her own gallery in Leicester Square and toured around the British Isles. So this image on the right is after George Stubbs' painting of the tigress. However, that is embroidery entirely. That is not a painting. So it really is a remarkable testament to her talents. Whether in the world of printmaking, textile design, pastels, or embroidery, these women had professional reputations during their lifetimes that spanned the European continent as well as the transatlantic world. We also addressed those who achieved recognized professional status through state-sponsored salons and national academies. By the later 18th century, the restrictions against women's involvement in formal artistic institutions began to relax, and we start to see a generational effect of established women artists training other women. Women also were able to start joining male artists' studios. Anne Guéret, who did this lovely drawing in the lower right there, was a study of Jacques-Louis David, the great painter of the time of the French Revolution. And her inspiring depiction of a fellow female student illustrates the increasing presence of women learning to draw from models in the academic setting. It might be hard for you all to see, but what she's drawing there is a nude male as an angel. So she's clearly having access to male models. As one of the founding members of London's Royal Academy, Angelika Kaufmann displayed history paintings regularly in the annual exhibitions. And Marie-Victoire Jacquetot's porcelain service of famous women in the upper right, commissioned by Napoleon as a gift to Empress Josephine, and she rejected it. Celebrates the long history of women rulers, authors, and philosophers. Several works in the exhibition also illustrated how women took agency in the long-standing tradition of portraying a woman as artistic muse and transformed it into bold statements about women as creative beings in their own right. Perhaps the most inspiring story is that of Sarah Biffen. Her image is there on the far left. A self-taught miniaturist of working-class origins who gained fame in the English country fair circuit for her ability to paint portraits on the spot with only her mouth. She was born without hands or feet, a condition called phocomelia, and it is a detail that she inscribes herself on her self-portrait drawing. It's very hard for you to see, but you can see it in person. It's kind of looping underneath her image there. Donning a Medal of Honor from the Royal Society of Arts and wearing fashionable clothes, she presents herself in the same visual traditions as artists such as Titian and Rembrandt, claiming her place in that history of self-portraiture. So this is another great triumph. The BMA was able to acquire that drawing in time for the exhibition as well. Another win. We were very excited. In order to help our visitors gain a deeper understanding of the material diversity on display in the exhibition, we provided an interpretation gallery that allowed visitors to touch similar materials represented in the show. And we included a demonstration piece of half-completed bobbin lace made by a regional lace maker. You can see it in the upper left. Audio guide stops throughout the exhibition incorporated the voices of contemporary makers narrating works produced in their chosen media. At the Art Gallery of Ontario iteration of Making Her Mark, we had an exciting opportunity to incorporate multisensory learning in the galleries through sound, touch, and smell. In addition to broadcasting instrumental music by women composers of the era and including additional material touch opportunities, we also worked with Dr. Melanie McBride at the Aroma Inquiry Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, I didn't know that existed, to create historically informed scent boxes paired with objects on view. You can see the images in the lower right. She custom made these scent boxes, which you could opt into, right? So they didn't just smell. You didn't have to smell them. And actually, the image in the lower right is my co-curator's father, leaning in to get a better sniff of cloister. They were cloister, parfum, the garden, and the snuff box. We paired them with works that we felt, we knew came from those kind of environments or those circumstances. Cloister had a really earthy, funky, mildewy smell. The garden, it didn't just smell like flowers, but it also smelled like the soil that the flowers grew in. Parfum and worn clothing were kind of a combined smell. They were next to the Anna Maria Garthwaite dress. And as you can imagine, it smelled like perfume, but it also smelled like body odor. And then the snuff box was really funky tobacco. So we wanted people to be able to engage in the evocative effects of smell that conjured up their own personal memories and emotive associations with the works on display. Our desire to resurface the stories and circumstances surrounding these women's artistic contributions is not a new one. Generations of feminist scholars, spurred on by the art historian Linda Nocklin's landmark call in 1971 to consider why there had been no great women artists, established entire fields of feminist scholarship and laudable exhibitions focused on women artists. But many of these efforts have been devoted to rediscovering women who achieved that narrative of exceptionalism through the celebrated art of painting. This is not surprising, since women painters were the majority of what we were taught in our art history classes, if women were included at all, further supporting the assumption that women artists of the past were rare. Indeed, at the beginning of our own planning and research, we realized that we had internalized these same biases. Early in the research phase, we feared we couldn't find enough works by women to support a major exhibition. We could not have been more wrong. During the planning process, we considered over 900 works of art for this exhibition and wrote over 400 loan requests. To find these objects, we spent a lot of time in museum storerooms and warehouses across the United States, in Canada, and in 7 European countries, and read through the essential archival and contextual research published by colleagues around the world. Carrying out the research needed to identify works by women makers meant not only questioning our own ingrained biases, but also sometimes convincing our colleagues at other institutions that objects in their collections were actually the result of women's work. And I'll also point out, you see the masks? We did this during the pandemic, so that added another layer of fun. To be clear, very few of the objects included in the exhibition were utterly new discoveries. Most had been published or were known to the institutions that housed them. But often they had not been on view for many years, or they had never been put in conversation with the broader context of the diverse landscape of women's creativity. The reason for this siloing effect has everything to do with the diverse materiality and the categories that have defined the way objects are displayed in art museums. Often these objects were of the types that have been excluded from categories of so-called high art and reassigned to the category of visual or material culture. When we shifted our perspectives to expand beyond painting and sculpture, we quickly realized that women worked in a dazzling array of media, and often particularly delicate or intricate ones like lace, paper quilling, that paper rolling, or wax. Moving away from painting and its associated myths of singular genius also led us to consider the essential and largely undocumented role that silent or forced labor played in the production of artistic culture. Further, we embraced the managerial and entrepreneurial roles that women played, typically under their husband's name, and left room for exploration of women's involvement where it might not be readily apparent, such as widows and corporate production, as I have mentioned. We also realized that researching women artists required not only adjusting our inherited blinders about which works were worth our attention, but also how to go about identifying these objects and the women associated with them. Many of the standard approaches ingrained in traditional research methods do not allow for consideration of the unexceptional women makers because their information was never meant to be captured in the traditional biographic format that prioritized creative genius and individualized heroism. Even the parameters by which historians operate often depend on basic data, such as name, birth, and death dates, or a body of work, that are absent when considering the role of creative women of the past. This is especially true for women and girls who were enslaved or coerced to work without remuneration, as well as those many women working on the lower rung of the manufacturing process or those who produced objects in the domestic setting. We discovered that collaboration and collective work were central concepts for understanding the way that the majority of women makers of the past actually worked, but it also proved to be the key to our project's success. Embracing a diversity of media and working methods provided an enriching lens through which to consider these women's means of creative expression. But it also required us to reach out to our community of colleagues and scholars who had expertise about specific cultures, materials, or subject matter that we did not possess. Its development unfolded over nearly 5 years, requiring the insight, assistance, and support of numerous individuals working in museums, private collections, and research facilities. Collaboration became a leitmotif for this exhibition's genesis. Sustained research and persistent investigation by an international curatorial and scholarly team of 15 collaborators resulted in a wide-ranging presentation of women's historic artistic creativity in every media at a variety of scale, material, and subject. With the assistance of these gracious and generous colleagues and many more, we crafted a truly unique presentation, making this the only major exhibition in North America to display such a variety of works exclusively made by women of the pre-modern era. Okay, so we found the works, then we had to bring them in. So identifying, researching, writing about, and negotiating the loans for this exhibition comprised only part of the process. Safely transporting and installing each of these objects with care and precision had been just as important. Assembling and displaying these extraordinary testaments to historical European women's creativity relied entirely on the diligent and sometimes Herculean efforts of our registration, design, installation, and conservation staffs, as well as the numerous couriers who safeguarded the works while in transit. And so often when I speak to graduate students who are like, I want to work in museums, what do I need to know? I'm like, make friends with your conservators and your registrars. Do it now. They will make the vision happen. To document the research and interpretation of this new narrative of Western art, the publications team produced a gorgeously illustrated catalog with 26 essays addressing the diversity of women's creative production. Reflecting the guiding ethos of the exhibition, the catalog diverged from a traditional approach by not providing individual entries for each object, which we felt overemphasized that biographical data that simply didn't exist for many of the works. Instead, the catalog includes essays about the exhibited objects grouped by media, allowing us to cast a wider net in the contextual consideration of women's involvement in various categories of artistic production. As such, the catalog is intended as a primer for the next generation of scholars and interested members of the public who want to learn more about how women of Europe made their marks in the history of art. Abandoning our presumptions about what it meant to be a great artist and what kind of objects qualify as worthy of displaying in a museum opened up a world of possibilities. Expanding beyond this single artist-focused format that prioritized large-scale painting, we aim to meet these women on their own terms, discovering their contributions through the works made in settings adjacent to or entirely outside the male-dominated academy and studio. Rather than cling to highly gendered and exclusionary notions of quality or genius, we subscribed instead to a philosophy of inclusiveness and generosity. Instead of limiting our understanding of the past through the binary lens of who and what are worthy of being in or out of the canon, this exhibition has shown the rich potential of approaching curatorial research with a yes-and attitude. We are fully aware that this attitude rankles against centuries of tradition. We did not reject concepts of beauty, skill, or accomplishment. Rather, we presented a range of objects so that they may resonate with audiences through differing modes of emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic pleasure, reflecting the human spirit on multiple levels as memorable and affecting art always has. In our pursuit to bring forward the stories of unexceptional women makers, we hope to have offered one way to reframe the history of Western art. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to take questions or thoughts. Here we go. We have a microphone, so if you can wait for the microphone.
I know that Britain has a tradition of hallmarking their silver, presumably silver made by men. But when you did have the silver pieces brought in, were you able to find those hallmarks, and were there records in those government offices of the hallmarks of the women, or did it require additional research through the factories or elsewhere to find that?
No, actually, so England is one of the places specifically in the 18th century that women were allowed to register their own mark. They did not need a man to do it. So you have right there, plain as day, names, dates, run of business. So that was actually really helpful. And so we, relied on the research that our colleagues had done because it was already there. We didn't have to go do more research. It was really more a question of bringing it into this context and highlighting. It was, in some ways, it was almost as simple as just putting the name on the label, which any institution can do. They just don't.
Is there any evidence that there were any patrons that supported these female artists? And what role did the church have in kind of tamping down the recognition of ladies?
So there's a long tradition of women patrons throughout Europe. There are examples that we know of where women, if they didn't specifically seek out women artists, they certainly seem to have supported them quite a bit. One in the 17th century in Holland, this woman Agneta Block, or Agnes Block, she actually was, she married very well, and then he died. Honestly, sorry men, if your husband died, and he had money, you made out pretty well back then. It was a freeing way. It was a channel that women could, pursue independence, essentially. And so she had this entire estate called the Vijverhof in the countryside outside of Amsterdam. And she was an avid botanical, she loved gardens, and she was into botanical studies. And she actually hired numerous women to come and do the natural illustrations. And so we had several examples in the show. And she would write on the back of them, so we know what her handwriting looks like. And there's an entire book in the Rijksmuseum library that of drawings that she collected. So there are examples. We know that women supported other women artists. One of the interesting things when putting this show together is we tried very hard not to impose modern concepts of feminism on the past, because it would have been incomprehensible to them. So we wanted to make sure we weren't putting words in other people's mouths of the past. So we didn't ever really see an example where someone's like, I'm only going to support women. No one says it out loud, but you do see kind of by default that that's what happened. Your question about the church tamping down. Well, a lot of the orphanages were run by religious bodies. They're, as I said, bringing in young girls who are undocumented and not being paid to create that lace or other textiles. And then convents, of course. They're both places where women could perhaps step away from the imposed cycle of marriage, childbirth, and death, and actually perhaps learn how to read and create fantastic things like the objects we included. But they're also ones that are completely under the control of male clergy. So, it's nothing sounds particularly great, frankly, from my personal standing now. But so, it's hard to say, that the church necessarily supported women, but I think there were ways that women kind of found workarounds, as they always do.
Thank you for an amazing amount of work.
Thanks.
And where do you see this going forward? Are they going to rewrite the history of art and include more women? And is there an opportunity to do this for American women artists who have been neglected over the years?
Yeah, so that was so when we were organizing this exhibition, one of the things we said, should we make this global? Should we go transatlantic? Should we go to, South Asia? Should we go to Africa and figure out these things? And then we just realized that's unfortunately incredibly impractical. But it did very much weigh in the back of our minds that these are channels that we're hoping that something like this will inspire people who are doing research dissertations right now to consider. We did actually have a study day for emerging scholars that was supported by the Crest Foundation. And so we had 10 scholars that applied and we selected, and they are very much interested in that global reach of women. There is an essay in which we just began to kind of explore it in the catalog called Women of the World, about how women engaged with global exchange. But it's a huge topic, and I think it's absolutely something that needs to be further explored. Do I wish they'll rewrite the history of art? We've been rewriting the history of art for a while, and it keeps kind of not really hitting the mark with the ladies. So we're hoping that the catalog is a start towards that, and I've actually heard from a lot of colleagues who are teaching that they have made their students order the catalog or they're assigning readings out of it. So we're doing it slowly.
All right. A shout out to the gorilla.
I'm going to jump
Yes,
in really quickly
great.
with a question from Zoom.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you touched a little bit on this in your talk, but someone would like to know more about the differences between how the exhibition was displayed at the BMA and the Ontario Museum, and what decisions had to be made between the two venues, kind of like the interpretation exhibit and the pastel painting you were talking about.
Right. Okay, so when you have an exhibition that's co-organized by two institutions, the goal is a certain amount of parity between the two. Specifically, if you're going to borrow something, you're going to hope that someone will lend it to both venues. It's more cost effective. It's, allows for a continuity of narrative. That was not always the case. Light exposure is a real issue for works on paper and textiles. And so we had to be very careful about what we asked for and whether they would lend it. Many places were very generous and let us have it in both places. But many lenders were very generous and let us have it in both places. But couldn't always be done. So sometimes, like I said, that beautiful Carrera pastel was only going to ever go to Baltimore, but it was okay because Toronto already owned one. So, you know, we had to make a lot of those decisions. We wrote 400 loan requests for 230 objects because we knew a lot of things were going to be no. Absolutely not. And then in terms of two different institutions, you know, you can have a certain amount of overlap in the checklist, but every institution has certain feelings about how they want to interpret it. And so we agreed to do the catalog together, to work on the checklist together, but the interpretation was always kind of its own thing at each institution. So the scent boxes and the multi-sensorial presentation was really kind of the stamp that the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, put on their presentation. Also, you're not occupying the same space in the two different institutions, so you had to change the display and the installation of the design to fit those spaces. So it's never going to be a replica no matter what you do. You do have to kind of let it be its own thing in each place. But it was still essentially the same narrative.
It amazes me how the collaboration between museums and you can come up with a program like this. Do you ever go out to outside sources? For instance, for the textiles, I have some ancient lace that I don't know what to do with. That, you know, my Italian grandmother brought from Italy in the 1800s.
Yeah.
I've already given away the wood bobbins that I saw in the picture.
Yeah.
Is there is there a need for those kinds of things, or is there an abundance of it that you can access?
Not knowing.
I'm willing to donate.
Yeah, okay. Well, you should talk to people here at Hillwood. They have some lace, although I know it's related to their specific founder. But in our cases, we started with institutions, so we started with museums. When we could not find something we were looking for, we went to private collectors, but that private collector had to be known to us, or someone had to tell us about it. So if you have secret amazing things, reach out to your museum, and if they don't want it, they might be able to tell you someone who does want it, because not every place can take everything, right? And it has a lot to do with the type of institution they are, their facilities, their staff. But if you think you have something fabulous, people are going to want to know about it, because if you keep it, we're never going to find out about it. Right. So in terms of an abundance, some things were easier than others. We were very lucky because as I said, textiles were a hard thing to ask for because of the light sensitivity. The Baltimore Museum of Art has a fantastic textiles collection. And the Cone Sisters, if you've heard of them, they're the ones that the reason Matisse is such a thing at the BMA is because of the Cone Sisters. They also happen to collect lace. And so we were able to not have to borrow the lace, and we could have it and then share it with the Art Gallery of Ontario. So we were very lucky in that regard. So it really just depended on what we were talking about. Things that were hard to find, if anybody has it, I'd love to know. Wax was really hard to find and also hard to ask for because it's incredibly fragile. And that paper rolling, that paper quilling, they're so stunning. And, I have not constantly come across lots of examples. But again, these things often are in storerooms. They're in warehouses. They're not on view. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
So with all the women artists who were doing silver work or with portraiture, were they doing that on top of raising a family and domestic life and everything? So it wasn't just a profession for them? No. They were doing both?
Yes, very good question. So we actually had a panel in the exhibition called Silent Labor, and it addressed the fact not only of the women who are sourcing materials, and we don't know who they are, we'll never know who they are, but also the fact that these women are all for the most part expected to marry and have children. This was they were working mothers before we ever came up with the term of working mothers. And they were doing this on top. And some of them, like Rachel Ruysch is a really celebrated late 17th, 18th century Dutch still life painter. She had a massive career for 5 decades, I believe. She also had 14 children. So, that woman was a powerhouse. But the sad reality, is also that many of these women, and part of the reason that we don't have that biographical data or we don't have a large body of work, is because they died in childbirth. And so many of their careers were cut short. And that Clara Eimart, the image of the moon that I showed you, she died at 34 in childbirth. So who knows what that woman could have gone on to do. So it's very much a part of their story. And so that was something that we called out several times in the catalog and label copy. So we tried to keep that at the forefront as well.
Thank you so much. Let's please give a huge round of applause. And please join us in the lobby for a book signing.
Thank you very